Hi everybody, this is Fractal Dementia and I'd like to welcome you to the second in a series of tutorials that I will be giving on the PySwarm application. This is an extension to the Carrara plugin, which is part of the Carrara animation sequence. So in this particular session, what I would like to do actually is not to spend much time with PySwarm as much as it is with Carrara, because there have been some people that have asked me recently about how to set up the scene. And since I've been working with developing this application for several months now, there are some things that I have discovered that are very important, and so I've sort of developed a set of steps that I follow in terms of setting up my Carrara scene. I've actually done this so many times that I've gotten pretty good about how long it takes, but just let me just step through this. And what I'm going to cover this time is, first of all, talk about creating a default scene. One of the things that I've discovered is that it's pretty useful to actually build a default scene, and I'll talk about this in terms of how to use that with the interface application PIA. Once you have that, then there are several things that you want to do, and what I found is there is an order that is important that you follow in terms of putting your scene together. First, I want to talk about orienting the BOIDs. There have been some individuals that have asked about that, because if you don't set up the BOIDs properly in terms of orientation, what you'll find out is that the BOIDs fly at an angle. They might fly backwards or sideways or whatever. So I'll talk about that. Then also setting up the hot point, which is the center of mass, and this needs to be done on the BOID, and then talk about naming, duplicating the BOIDs, and then once you have the BOIDs duplicated, then numbering them, and then adding other objects to your scene. And in fact, what I'm actually going to do is add some objects to my scene at the beginning as part of the default, but often what you'll want to do after you create the BOIDs is potentially add other objects so that you can have an idea about where to set up any containment zones and so forth. And once we've gone through that, then I want to go to the PIA program and just basically talk about some of the basic parameters. Since I'm currently working on updating the application to version 2, there's actually going to be a significant number of changes that I'm making to the layout. So rather than spending a whole lot of time at this point, I'll wait until I've actually completed or nearly completed the application. Then I'll go into more detail about the parameters and the structure or the organization of how PIA is set up and so forth. And then I'll talk briefly about some of the kinds of things that you can do in terms of tweaking the script to get the BOIDs to behave in the way that you want them to do. And it actually is fairly quick and easy to do, but I will briefly talk about that. Okay, so let's jump right into Carrara and take a look at what it takes to set up your scene. Now what I did, as I mentioned, is I went ahead and set up an existing default scene to use with my PySwarm BOID application. So whenever I get ready to start a new project, I always start with one of these default scenes, and I'll explain why now. So if you'll notice that in my scene I have already defined a PySwarm camera. This is a camera that I create that I'm going to actually use, and as the BOIDs move about the scene, the camera will actually move with them. Then also there's a camera focus. This object is actually defined as a helper. It's a target helper. So as the BOIDs move about, you can also define a particular object that will move with the BOIDs as at the center of mass of the entire group. And so if you want to, for example, keep the camera moving and also have it set to always move with the BOIDs, this would be a very simple way to do that. So we've got a camera that I'm going to move. I've got a focus point that moves as the BOIDs move about. Now these are objects that actually are manipulated by PySwarm. And I also have another one called a safe zone, and basically it serves as the foundation for where the BOIDs are allowed to move within my scenery. So what I don't want is BOIDs flying off into the distance, and if you don't have any type of a safe zone set within your scene, that's basically what they're going to do. So generally speaking, I create one. Now you'll notice that it's not visible. Basically, this is just designed to help me to identify where BOIDs are allowed to fly. Now, once I have this set up, let me go directly into PySwarm. You'll notice in my PySwarm application that within the camera parameters, I already typed in the name of the camera, and under the focus parameters, I've typed in the name of my focus. So even in my default project, so now whenever I start a new project, the new projects always begin by taking the default information and loading that in and using that as the basis for continuing to work with the project. So what I did was I've taken all of the information for my default project in the scene and then loaded that into the various parameters. Also, you'll notice under containment, the first zone that I have defined, I say it's an active zone even though I have not activated the rule, and I created a safe zone. And if I go to the settings, the transform settings for my safe zone, you'll notice that the center 00500 is the right location that I've entered here. In addition, the size value 3000, 3000, 1000 have already been entered. So I already have the basic information created into my default project. And as I added a new project, then I'm working directly off of the default settings in my default scene. Okay, so let's go back into the Carrara scene and begin to add BOIDs. And in one of the things that most likely the objects that you're going to insert into your scene that you're going to animate with the PySwarm application most likely are objects that are already created. So one of the first things that you need to begin to think about is the orientation of the objects. Now, PySwarm, when I initially designed it, I developed it with the idea that the BOIDs need to be facing in a particular way. So if I, for example, if I take the F15 object, this is an object that comes with the Carrara application. If I go into it, one of the things that you'll notice is that in this particular case, if I go to the look at the orientation and rotation values, they're all cleared out to 0. You'll notice that in this particular case, the object is facing in the positive x-axis. And when the PySwarm application runs, it assumes that that is exactly the case, that the objects are going to be facing in the positive x-axis with the rotation and orientation values set to 0. Now in the case when that's not true, for example, we'll note that if I drop the F22 in here, again the orientation and rotation values are set to 0, but you'll notice in this particular case that the object is facing in the positive y-axis. Now the assumption would be that in order to get this into the right position, all I need to do is just rotate it 90 degrees and voila, it's facing in the right direction. Unfortunately, PySwarm overwrites not only the center locations but also the rotational values, and you'll notice that all I've done in this case is I've just changed the y rotational value by -90 degrees. So it's really not going to help, because when I run the PySwarm interface, when I run the script, it's going to overwrite that -90, so it's just basically going to reset back to the 0 value. So what I need to do is actually rotate this object so that it's facing in the positive x-axis without necessarily changing the orientation and rotation values. And in order to do that, in this particular case, all I need to do is grab the children objects, which in this case luckily is only 2, and then instead of rotating the entire object, what I'm going to do is rotate the children objects 90 degrees. Now you'll notice in this case that the BOID that I want to manipulate with PySwarm still shows orientation and rotation values of 0, even though I've actually rotated each of the children objects. But unfortunately, as a result of that, I now have modified it in a way that it's out of position. So I just need, in this case, to just take each of the objects in my scene, the sub-elements, and reorient them. In other words, move them back in to position. So, and once I have that, now you'll notice that I have my my object. It's rotated, and in addition, now it's all set to 0. So now at this point, I actually can use this as a BOID in my scene. The other thing that the PySwarm works on is that when you add the BOIDs to the scenes, they don't have to be the same object. In other words, I could have a mix of different kinds of airplane. If I wanted to run them as a single flight, it would do so. It wouldn't even care. In fact, one of the things that I've discovered is that your BOIDs can even include lights and camera. So the PySwarm script doesn't really care what kind of object it is that you're manipulating. It only cares for the fact that you've named it all the same thing. Now, we've talked about orientation. There's another component of this, and that's called the that we need to consider, and that is the hot point of the object. Now, because the rotational values, in other words, the heading, the banking, and the pitching that PySwarm will add to the motion of the BOID, it's all based on the hot point of the object. So we want to make sure that when we've made the appropriate adjustments, that we have the hot point at the right location. Let me explain. If I were to move the hot point, let's say, to the front of this particular object, and as PySwarm manipulates this object about, one of the things that you'll notice is that if I'm going into, let's say, some type of a pitch up or down, that it's moving it in a way that the aircraft is not at the center of mass, which is normally, whether it's an animal or a machine, generally speaking, it's all going to be working off the center of mass. So one of the things that you'll want to do early on after you've added your object is to make sure that the hotspot that you've selected is actually centered somewhere near the center of mass. So in this particular case, if I center it somewhere over the front wings and I begin to rotate the object about, this is more of what I expect to see of an object that's actually going through banking, pitching, and changes in heading. So that's another component of what you need to consider as part of creating the BOID objects actually before you begin duplicating it. Okay, so now that I've got my BOIDs entered into the scene, I've got the hot points identified. The next thing I need to do is look at the naming conventions. Now, because PySwarm is expecting to find the BOIDs, and the way that it finds it is through the names. In this particular case, I've added two BOIDs. They have different names, and I have to come up with some type of a standard name for this. So I'm just going to change the name to this to be Fighter. And since I'm going to be adding more to this right now, I'm just going to call them both Fighter. And in my scene, now when I set up my PySwarm scene, I now have the objects defined in a way that it actually is going to work with it correctly. Now I'm ready to begin duplicating it. Now there are several different ways in which you can duplicate it. Now I know that the natural tendency, one of the things that some people may do is just say, oh, well, I'll just take these objects, I'll drag a whole bunch of these onto my scene, and I'll just work with that. Which is fine if you only have a couple of BOIDs that you're manipulating, but let's say that I want to create a scene that's manipulating 50 or 100 of these. The problem is that when I drag and drop objects into my scene, I'm actually adding additional objects to my list. So if I'm adding a whole bunch of these, in essence I've created a scenario that quickly I can run out of memory. So a better solution to this is to look at actually duplicating the BOIDs in my scene. Now there actually are two different ways that we can do that. If I'm only going to be entering let's say 10, maybe 15 BOIDs to the scene, probably the fastest way is just simply to duplicate it. Now there are certain times in which maybe I want to create the BOIDs in a way that they're all laid out in some type of well-defined structure. In that case, what I'm going to do instead is I'll actually load a replicator in, drop the BOIDs into that, and then duplicate them right off of the replicator, and then go in and delete the replicator. So that actually works pretty well in large number of BOIDs, but since I'm only going to be working with, in this tutorial, several, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to select the two fighter aircraft and then just hit Control D a couple of times to add the additional BOID. So I think 6 probably for this tutorial is adequate, and that's really what I'm going to work with for the rest of this discussion. Now once I have them entered, probably the next thing I'll want to do is actually move them around a little bit, so reposition them in some type of maybe like they would be doing if they're flying in some type of a group pattern. Now they will move around once you start into the animation, but at least you can start with some type of a sequence of how you might actually think about them initially beginning. So once I've laid them out, I've got them organized, I got the number that I need to do. The only thing I have left to do at this point is just to make sure that because PySwarm is expecting a unique name for each of the BOIDs in the scene, I just need to number them. Okay, so I paused the recording briefly while I went in and added the numbers to the BOID. So now I'm pretty much done with setting that up. One thing that I'm going to actually add to this scene is an attractor object, so that the BOIDs actually don't fly too far away from the center of my animation scene. I'm going to add a radio antenna to this object, and but this is actually much like a study that I had done last week, which was looking at aircraft flying about another object, in this case the antenna. So I've added this object into my scene, and I'm going to adjust the height of my aircraft down to about a point where they're at the same level as the antenna. And what I'm actually going to expect to see is that when I get to the animation sequence, my BOIDs should actually fly pretty much around the object. Occasionally they may fly very close to it, maybe even fly through it. But in essence, the sequence that I'm looking to generate is something of the order of flying about this attractor. So that's pretty much it for the setting up of the scene. The one thing I do want to add to this is an infinite plane, just so I have something in the background to be able to get a better sense about the motion of the aircraft around my attractor. So let's go back into the PIA and begin to actually set up some of the parameters that we're going to need to run the animation sequence. Now I'm going to start with the time start is going to be at 0, but I'm actually going to run this through until, let's say, 60 seconds. That should be enough time to get a good sense about how the animation is working. Now, one of the things that I've observed in running various animations of simulating real life animals like let's say birds and fish versus aircraft and other mechanical systems, I've noticed that if you're running mechanical systems, you're probably better off in keeping the keyframes per second rate very low, as in usually 1 to 3 works pretty well. In general, for aircraft, I pretty much go with 3 keyframes per second. If I'm doing fish, for example, or birds, often I'll set this rate at between 10 and 15. I'm going to clear the keyframes at the start, because if I do several iterations of this animation sequence, I want to make sure that I've cleared out any previous keyframes that were inserted prior to that. And as you'll notice, at this point, this would probably be a good time to create my project because I forgot to do that. So I'm going to go down here to my project. You'll notice I really don't have anything other than the default. I'm going to click New and say I'm going to call this a fighter sequence. I'm going to give it as a name, and at this point now I've taken the default values that were defined in my settings, and when I created the fighter sequence as a new project, it copies all of those parameters over. So you'll notice that the time sequence is between 0 and 60, 3 keyframes per second. I've cleared out the keyframes at the start. I'm actually going to manipulate the camera and the camera focus, and as you remember at the start of this, I had said that I preset all of the camera names and the focus name so that it's a constant setting. I don't ever have to reset these at a later time, but I will need to modify my camera offset. Now, generally what you need to do for the offset is just get a sense about what the size of the objects are. So if you'll notice, the fighter aircraft are about 40-45 feet in length. So in order to keep most or all of the aircraft in the scene at one time, I probably am going to start with something like let's say 200 feet in the X and Y plane, and I'm actually going to keep that fairly low, just slightly above the plane that the aircraft are flying in. And okay, so that's pretty much it for the scene settings. In the BOID setting, I need to follow the naming conventions for the BOIDs, which is fighter. And since I'm going to be adding the number to that, I don't need to add a number like 1, 2, and 3. That's going to be automatically inserted. I have 6 BOIDs in my scene, and for this particular scene, I'm going to start with the current BOID position as well as the current heading. Now, what that means in essence, if I go back to my scene, PySwarm will begin by looking at the location and the direction that the BOIDs are facing, and that is what it's going to start with if I have these two values set. And in order to do this, there's one additional setting I need to set, which is the initial speed, and I'm going to, let's say, start with a value of 100. So that's 100 feet per second, and also I'm going to use banking. Most aircraft do bank when they turn, so we're going to leave this on. I'm not going to activate either the 2D motion settings because we do want the aircraft to fly up and down, and also I'm going to leave off the localizing rules. Now automatically, or in the default settings, I already have it set up so that cohesion, separation, and alignment, these are the three basic rules of BOID animation, I leave turned on. Now what I do need to do is I need to also set a separation distance for the BOIDs, and as I said, since the aircraft are about 40 feet in length, I probably need to keep something like, let's say, 200 feet distance separation between the BOIDs, and that's if the two BOIDs fly closer than that amount. What this will do is it will activate the rule, and you'll notice that the aircraft will tend to try to fly away from each other. I'm going to activate or leave activated the alignment rule, and since we have an attractor set up in our scene, what I'm going to actually do is leave off the containment at this point. I may come back and turn it on, and you'll notice that there are two activation settings. One is to activate the rule, and in this case I have it turned off even though I have activate the zone turned on for zone 1, which means that even though I got this value turned on, I'm not actually going to use it. It won't even be applied to the script. If I wanted to apply the rule, if I just click here, and then it would activate that particular zone, or I could activate the rule and turn off the zone. And there are 10 different zones that I can pick and choose from, so I could actually have quite a number of different kinds of zones for my settings, and then I can activate and deactivate each one at the same time that I have my rules turned on. But at this point, let's leave the containment turned off, And for the attractor, I'm actually going to turn this on. Now, what I'll need to do is actually insert the name of the attractor object, in which case I'm just going to leave it as it was, which is the, I assume that means radio telescope. But let's see, landing I'm going to leave off. Speed limit I'm actually going to activate. And I'm going to set this to a minimum of 200 feet per second and a maximum of, let's say, 250 feet. That gives us a little bit of variation in terms of the speed. I need 2500, it's 250. And then I'm going to leave the max turn values turned off at this point. Okay, so I've gone through the settings. I've identified sort of where I want to start with. Now, one of the things that I would suggest is not to spend a whole lot of time sort of pre-planning out which particular parameters you want to activate and what's the right settings. What I found is a lot more useful to just go in there with a general idea of saying, okay, this rule I want to turn on, this one I don't, this is the kind of general setting I want, and then apply those and then see what kind of results you get back, and then go back and adjust those. So you'll get better results if you go in with the idea of tweaking this maybe 6, 8, 10, maybe even 15 times to get the right kind of animation sequence that you want, and not worry so much about trying to make sure you get it right the first time. Okay, so with that in mind then, we have all of the settings for this. Now, one of the things that I would definitely suggest that we do is that you should save, first of all, your Carrara scene, and I'm going to call this the fighter scene. And I would suggest doing that before you import PySwarm in for the first time. In general, I've just discovered that if anything goes wrong or if you have any difficulties, it's always useful to have a backup of the file that you can always recover from. Okay, so I've got all the settings. I'm actually going to save my parameters just in case. Generate the script. Yeah. So one of the things that PIA will do is it goes through and validates that all of the parameters that you have set are seem to be correct. Now, what this is saying is that I initially set the initial speed of the BOIDs to be at 100 feet per second, but my speed limit was set between 200 and 250. So this is telling me that my initial speed is outside of that range. Do I want to continue? Well, in fact, at this time I'm going to say no, because I need to go back and change that. I'm going to reset the initial speed to be 200 feet per second, so that it is at least now within the range. I'm going to generate my screen, my setting, and the fighter sequence, I'm going to leave the file name to be the same, save it off. It now has created the script. I go into my Carrara scene, I do an import, and since I stored this into a separate file, I need to actually find where it's at, which is I saved it off into my release folder. I select the file and I say open, and that's it. So now it has imported my script into my settings. I can go back into the sequencer and you'll notice that it has inserted the keyframes, and for 60 seconds I'll need to adjust my time range, and just to get it, I'm going to actually go into the PySwarm camera, and you'll see that if I show the production frame, I can begin the animation sequence. And you'll notice that in general that the first time through, is like I said, you're not ever going to get it right. So what often happens is that you'll need to go back and make some additional adjustments to the settings that we have here. But you will notice that it does animate. So we already have now a basic animation sequence that we just can work with and begin to improve on. Now, one of the things you'll notice that the aircraft are flying below the plane, the infinite plane, the ground that we have set. So really probably want to go in and adjust that because that's definitely not going to work right. So let me just go through a couple of variations in terms of how to go in and make some adjustments to this. I'm going to go in and actually turn on the containment and accept that instead of right now what I have is in the Z plane the center is 500 feet, but my size is actually 1,000, so it actually goes to the ground. I'm actually going to raise this up slightly. I'm going to say 600, and instead of 1,000 feet I'm going to make this 500 feet. And let's see what that does. Not going to change any of the other settings. Generate the script, save it, replace it, go to my import. I import the Py script, and let's see what happens now. Okay, so you'll notice now that even though the planes actually are still flying below the low plane, it actually is flying a little better than what it was the first time. So we have begun to get a little bit more improvement in terms of the animation sequence, and I probably can get a better sense of this from the director's view. If I go back to that. Okay, so the intent of this was really to kind of give you an idea of how to get started, and obviously this would need a lot more tweaking and adjustments to get the aircraft to fly within a specific area correctly, but hopefully this will at least get you started. And I'm actually going to work on this a little bit, make a few more adjustments, and then I will post this Carrara scene out to have it available for you if you want to download it and look at the script and how it gets generated. Anyway, I hope you find this useful, and good luck with using this to help you to animate your Carrara scenes, and be back with a later animation again sometime. Thanks.